You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots.
Today's guests, Chairman and Vice Chairman, PBS Committee, Mike Cowan and Scott Ryan. Here's your host, Ryan Argenta.
Welcome back to the Engage podcast. This is an Engage short. I've got the PBS gurus back. Mike Cowan, Scott Ryan. Welcome back, fellas. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. So the topic of unstacking, we've heard the term. It's been on mainstream MEC news lately. Let's just get right into it. What is unstacking?
Unstacking, also called coverage, you can use the terms interchangeably, is a way for PBS to make sure you don't have too much open time on a given part of the month. Okay. On the line side. On the reserve side, unstacking or coverage is the only way for PBS to force pilots to work certain days as a reserve pilot. For line holders, it's typically during holiday months. That's where you'll see it the most, where nobody wants to work on Christmas. So everybody asks for it off. And PBS can oftentimes build a line all around Christmas, pretty far down the seniority list for that category. If it were to do that, then you would have a huge chunk of open time, a spike, if you will, or a stack around the holiday. And then the problem becomes that open time drives your reserve requirements, because that's how the required and available reserves, that is driven off of open time. So if you leave a huge chunk of trips all sitting on Christmas, you're not going to be able to cover them all with reserves. And so coverage or unstacking is a process PBS uses in the process to recognize that it's going to have too much open time. And it begins forcefully assigning those trips in those stacks to make sure that those stacks are not too large by the time it runs out of line holders.
Okay. And a telltale sign you've been assigned coverage, or if you've been unstacked, so to speak, is when you look at the wide report and you see purple on your line.
Correct. And that's for line holders or for reserves. So line holders, you'll have the purple, magenta trips. And for reserves, they'll have magenta, purple reserve assignments for coverage.
And is that the same where the plug in a category would normally get reserve has a line of magenta trips across the board? And like, how did, the plug got all of these trips? Is that unstacking as well?
Yes, because it got down near the bottom and it just based on the amount of open time. There are times, particularly in wide body categories, where because of the trip lengths, you'd have a slot 8, 9, 10 days that was coverage. And so any trip that touches those days is going to be purple down at the bottom.
And who controls the coverage, or who dictates who's going to be unstacked or made to cover trips?
It's outlined in the PWA in MOU number 1, which you'll find at the tail end of the PWA. And it gives the PBS administrator, the company, the ability to unstack with some rules around it or coverage. So for line holders for a non-holiday month, and to get that information, you have to go look in section 23 that talks about the holidays that affect personal drops and authorized personal drops and individual vacation day drops. Those vacation days, those are quote vacation months for the purposes of coverage or unstacking. For a line holder, if it is one of those holiday months, you are safe, or you cannot be unstacked if you're in the top 50%. Okay. 50% of line holders can get forced into coverage on a holiday month. On a non-holiday month, which is really only 3 to 4 months, depending on where Easter and Good Friday fall, the top 70% are safe. So only the bottom 30% of line holders can be forced into coverage. Now, whether or not the company uses that is up to the company. They can go up to those limits, and oftentimes they'll run it without coverage to see how it looks, and it results in too much open time on given days. And then they try the same run with coverage turned on. And part of the equation there, that this is also spelled out in the PWA and MOU number 1, is how much of a stack they have to leave. So there is a minimum stack height that the company has to leave after coverage, and that is 6% of line holders. So to put that in firm perspective, let's say we have a category with 200 pilots, 20% of whom are on reserve. So that'd be 40 reserve pilots, 160 line holders. 6% of 160 line holders is 9.6 or 10. So at the bottom of the wide report, if they've used coverage, then there's going to have to be 10 duty periods stacked up of open time on any given day.
Those are the trips that are at the very bottom of the wide report.
Correct. The open trips. And that number, that 6%, drives how much open time the company has to leave. In other words, they can't get rid of all the open time and unstack cover all the way to the bottom, leave zero open time over Christmas. In that notional category, 200 pilots and 160 line holders, That's variable number one, the stack height. And variable number two is how high you can go seniority wise before just can't use coverage. So like I said, in the holiday month, those top 50% of line holders are not susceptible to coverage. Now, that's not to say they're going to get the day off, because there is still denial mode as a line holder, right? As a line holder, hey, I'd love the weekends off, but I don't get the weekends off, but I'm not in coverage. I just can't get the weekends off if I want a line. That's the difference. You still have denial mode as a line holder, where you may still be working on those days. It's just not coverage.
Just zooming out a little bit, backing up. So the PWA does protect us from coverage to a certain degree. So our current PWA says only the bottom 50% of line holders, or the bottom 30% of line holders in a non-holiday month, of which there's only 3, maybe 4.
3 to 4, correct.
Can have coverage. But 85% of reserve pilots can be unstacked or can have coverage. And so those are on-call days that are the magenta or purple color, right?
That is correct. That's based off of 12M5 in the PWA that dictates each day of the bid period has to be available as an X date of 15% of the reserve pilots. Now, I will point out that there's no such thing as denial mode. On reserves, you get the days off you want, or you're forced into coverage. So coverage is the only mechanism for reserves to drive the days that the company needs or wants to make sure they have adequate reserve coverage.
So a little bidding nugget here. Is it a good practice then to think, if you're in a holiday month and you're in the bottom 50% of line holders, you may want to hedge your bid by bidding some trips over that holiday that you wouldn't mind doing if you have to work over the holiday?
Absolutely. And that's all in the PBS reference handbook. We have a whole section on holiday bidding that talks about a lot of techniques for that. And not only that, you should always have a line bid and reserve bid in whatever order you want them. So if you have days you must have off and you want to be a line holder, then your first bid group should be, hey, I want to be a line holder, and here's the days off I have to have, with a conditional like else start next. Say, hey, I need the 15th and 16th off. Prefer off 15, 16, else start next. Then my next bid group is a reserve bid group. And I put the same exact line in that reserve bid group. Prefer off 15, 16, else start next. Then I put 2 more bid groups, line and reserve, knowing now I'm working on the 15th and or 16th, but I still want to be line or reserve and back those bids up. Part of the problem is, and you made my point there for me, you don't know if you're going to be in the top 50% of line holders, because you don't know how many people senior to you are taking reserve, right? So you could be right at the 50% point in the category. And then depending on how many pilots in the category above you take reserve, you don't know where you're going to fall in that point, right? Or you could be at 60% and you might end up being 50% of line holders, depending on how many reserve pilots are above you. So you can kind of sit down with a piece of paper and work through that a little bit, but I found the best way, you can tell PBS, hey, I want these days off. If I don't get them, I want to try a different strategy, a different bid group or reserve versus line, because maybe I don't get coverage as a reserve pilot there, but I do as a line holder, or vice versa.
Gotcha. So PBS reference handbook, good source to go to. You can find that on your company iPad in the ALPA folder. You can also find it on the ALPA website, on the PBS website. It's also linked from NavBlue PBS, right?
Yes. If you look on the info tab of PBS, which is the first page that pops up, if you scroll down below the table that shows all of the ALV and line construction window and everything, there's helpful information like the link to our website, a link to the PBS reference handbook, et cetera.
And then I want to plug again, because this is a great service, but you can submit a PBS bid inquiry, which is linked through DeltaNet scheduling crew resources bidding, a PBS bid inquiry, and the PBS committee will actually look at your bid before bids close to see if you've done something that you've wanted to do, right?
Absolutely. Every month. And I tell pilots all the time, please use the service. It's fairly quick turnaround. We have someone on duty every month, the 5th through the 11th. We would so much rather look at your bid beforehand than after. It's so much better to fix bids ahead of time.
Perfect. So unstacking, we'll leave it there. It sounds like unstacking, a way for the company to manipulate how many open time trips remain. It also affects line holders and reserve holders. It also may affect the number of green slips they have to give out. It affects reserve coverage, reserve availability. So if I'm a pilot, I want less coverage. If I'm the company, I want more coverage. And that takes care of my open time, which takes care of my green slips, which is productivity.
Yes. And it's just one variable in there because manning is a big part of all of that too. Realize that ALV is tied to the aircraft and the seat. That's it. So every 320 captain across Delta has the same ALV. And one base, they might have way more flying per pilot than another base. And that base with more block hours shoved into the category per pilot is going to have fewer pilots on reserve in order to cover all the flying with that ALV. So they can't just bump the ALV up in that one category. It's set for the seat and fleet for that number. And so manning is a huge part of it. We see it every single month where you'll have categories that non-holiday month, and they've got a significant amount of coverage, both reserve and line, but the same aircraft type and seat at a different base has zero coverage, unstacking.
Scott?
Just like to reemphasize the PBS reference handbook on your AFB. If you're a pilot like me who likes pictures, you look at page 66 and there's a beautiful picture of the stacks that exist in December if we don't have coverage. And the protection we have in the PWA is to make those stacks after they've run PBS. There can only be 6% of the number of line holders open time remaining in those stacks on every day. So like you said, at the bottom of the wide report, after the bid runs, there's still quite a few open time trips, but the company can limit that to 6% of the number of lines.
Very good. Mike Cowan, Scott Ryan, PBS gurus. This is a great nugget. Unstacking. It's affecting all of us, line holders, reserve, and it affects our quality of life and productivity. You can expect other PBS podcasts. They're coming up soon. So stick with us, the Engage podcast. Thanks very much for being here.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
This has been Engaged, the podcast for Delta pilots. Thanks for listening. My name is Ryan Argenta. Stay safe and keep the rubber on the road.
You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or your favorite podcast platform, and receive notifications when a new episode is available.